The phone rang at 3:17 in the morning. I know because I looked at the clock twice before I picked up, trying to decide if it was worth answering. At 68 years old, calls at that hour are never good news. Usually it's a wrong number, sometimes a scam. Once in a while, it's someone you know in the hospital. I answered. A woman's voice, professional but strained, asked if I was Catherine Renford. I said yes. She said she was calling from Mercy General Hospital in Portland. She said there'd been a car accident, that a man had been brought in unconscious, and that when they'd run his identification through the system, my name had come up as next of kin. I told her there must be a mistake. I didn't have any family in Portland. She paused. Then she said the name, Daniel Renford. I stopped breathing. She asked if I knew him. I couldn't answer. She asked again, more gently this time, and I heard myself say, "That's my son." She said, "Can you come to the hospital?" I said, "My son died 24 years ago." There was a long silence on her end. Then she said, very carefully, the man we have here is alive. He's in critical condition, but he's alive. His ID says Daniel Renford, date of birth March 7th, 1973. Is that your son?" I said yes. She gave me the address and told me to come as soon as I could. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after I hung up, staring at the wall. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do with them. I got dressed in the dark, grabbed my purse and keys, and walked out to the car. I don't remember the drive. I don't remember parking. I just remember walking through the automatic doors of the emergency room and hearing the fluorescent hum of the lights overhead. The nurse at the desk recognized me before I could say anything. She'd been the one who called. She took me down a hallway into a small consultation room and asked me to sit. A doctor came in a few minutes later, young, maybe 40, with tired eyes and the kind of calm that comes from delivering bad news too many times. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel. He sat down across from me and asked if I was ready to hear what he had to say. I nodded. He said the man they'd brought in had suffered severe head trauma in the accident. He was stable for now, but unconscious. They'd performed a CT scan and found old scarring on his brain, evidence of a previous traumatic injury, maybe years old. He said they'd also found records in the system, medical records, under the name Daniel Renford. He asked if I wanted to see him. I said yes. He led me down another hallway, through a set of double doors and into the ICU. The room was dim and quiet except for the beeping of machines. There was a man in the bed, his head wrapped in bandages, his face swollen and bruised. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. I didn't recognize him. But I knew him. I don't know how to explain that. He didn't look like my son, not the way I remembered him. Daniel had been 19 when he died. This man was in his 40s. His face was weathered, his hands were scarred, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But the shape of his nose, the angle of his jaw, the way his left ear stuck out just slightly, those were Daniel's. I sat down in the chair next to the bed and didn't move for a long time. Dr. Patel came back in and asked if I needed anything. I asked him how they'd found me. He said Daniel had a state ID in his wallet with an emergency contact number listed, mine. He said the ID had been issued 3 years ago in Oregon. I asked if there was anything else in his wallet. Dr. Patel hesitated. Then he handed me a plastic bag. Inside was the wallet, a set of keys, a gas station receipt, and a small photograph. The photograph was old, creased, faded. It was a picture of me holding a baby. I recognized it immediately. It had been taken the day Daniel was born. I asked Dr. Patel if I could stay. He said yes. I sat with him through the night. I didn't sleep. I just watched him breathe and tried to understand how this was possible. Daniel died in 1999. He was 19 years old, a sophomore in college, studying engineering. He'd been driving home for winter break when his car went off the road in a snowstorm. They found the car 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine. It had burned. There wasn't much left. We buried him in a closed casket. I'd mourned him for 24 years. I'd visited his grave every month. I'd kept his room exactly the way he'd left it for the first 5 years, then slowly packed it away when the silence became too heavy. I'd learned to live around the hole he'd left behind. And now he was here, alive, breathing, 43 years old. I didn't know what to feel. By morning, I'd started asking questions. I found Dr. Patel in the hallway and asked him to show me the medical records he'd mentioned. He took me to his office and pulled up the file on his computer. The records went back 7 years. The earliest entry was from a clinic in Eugene, a routine physical. The patient had listed no permanent address, no insurance, paid in cash. There were other entries after that: a prescription for antibiotics, treatment for a broken wrist, a dental cleaning, all of them under the name Daniel Renford, all of them paid for in cash. I asked Dr. Patel if there was any way to verify identity beyond the ID. He said they could run a DNA test if I consented. I did. The results came back 2 days later. It was a match. The man in the ICU was my son. I sat in that consultation room and stared at the paper in my hands until the words stopped making sense. Dr. Patel asked if I was all right. I told him I didn't know. He said Daniel was starting to show signs of waking up. He said it might still be a few days, but his brain activity was improving. He asked if I had any questions. I had 1,000 questions. I didn't know where to start. I asked him if Daniel had said anything when they'd brought him in. Dr. Patel checked his notes. He said the paramedics had reported that Daniel had been conscious briefly at the scene. He'd said a name, just once, before he'd lost consciousness again. The name was Carl. I didn't know anyone named Carl. I called my daughter that night. Rachel was 40 now, living in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids. She'd been 16 when Daniel died. I hadn't told her about the hospital yet. I hadn't known how. I told her everything. She didn't believe me at first. She thought I'd misunderstood, that it was a case of mistaken identity. I told her about the DNA test. She went quiet. Then she said she'd drive down in the morning. She arrived the next afternoon. We went to the ICU together. She stood in the doorway and looked at him the same way I had, with recognition and disbelief tangled together. She asked me what we were supposed to do. I said I didn't know. That night I went home and started looking. I pulled out the old boxes from the attic, the ones I'd packed away years ago. I found the file from the accident, police reports, insurance documents, the coroner's report. The coroner's report identified the body based on dental records. I read it 3 times. The match had been confirmed by a forensic odontologist in December of 1999. I called the county medical examiner's office the next morning. I explained the situation. The woman on the phone sounded confused, then skeptical, then concerned. She said she'd look into it and call me back. She called me back 6 hours later. She said the forensic odontologist who'd handled the case had retired years ago, but she'd managed to track him down. His name was Dr. Vincent Caro. He lived in Arizona now. She gave me his number. I called him. He remembered the case. He said it had been difficult because the body had been burned so badly. He said the dental records had been provided by Daniel's dentist at the time, a Dr. Alan Pritchard. He said the match had been close enough to confirm identity under the circumstances. I asked him how close. He hesitated. Then he said, "Close enough that I didn't question it at the time. But if you're telling me there's a DNA-confirmed living match, then something went wrong." I asked him what could have gone wrong. He said the records could have been switched, or falsified. He said it wasn't common, but it happened, usually in cases involving insurance fraud or identity theft. I asked him if he still had copies of the records. He said he'd have to check. He'd call me back. He called me back 2 days later. He said he'd found the file in his storage unit. He said he'd send me a copy if I wanted. I said yes. The file arrived a week later. Inside were copies of the dental X-rays that had been used to identify the body. I took them to a dentist in town, someone I trusted, who'd known Daniel when he was younger. I asked him to compare them to Daniel's old records, which I still had. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said they didn't match. I asked him if he was sure. He said yes. The X-rays were similar, same approximate age, same general structure, but the details were wrong. Fillings in different places. A root canal that Daniel never had. He said whoever had been in that car, it wasn't my son. I sat in his office and felt something cold settle into my chest. I asked him if someone could have falsified the records intentionally. He said yes. If someone had access to dental files and knew what they were doing, they could swap records and make it look legitimate. especially in a case where the body was too damaged to verify visually. I asked him who would have access. He said a dentist, or someone who worked in a dental office. I went home and looked up Dr. Alan Pritchard. He'd been Daniel's dentist since Daniel was 12. I'd trusted him. I'd sat in his waiting room dozens of times. He'd retired in 2004 and moved to California. I found an address and a phone number. I called. A woman answered. She said Dr. Pritchard had passed away 3 years ago. I asked if she was his widow. She said yes. I told her I was looking into an old case and asked if she knew anything about his practice. She said not much. She said he'd sold the practice when he retired and hadn't talked about it much after that. I asked if he'd had a partner or an associate. She said yes. A man named Carl De Laurentiis. I felt my stomach drop. I asked her what happened to Carl. She said she didn't know. She said he and her husband had had a falling out before the practice was sold. She didn't know the details, but she remembered it had been bitter. I thanked her and hung up. I looked up Carl De Laurentiis. It took me 2 days, but I found him. He was living in Washington State, just outside of Tacoma. He worked as a dental hygienist now. I didn't call. I got in my car and drove. It took me 5 hours. I found his address, a small house at the end of a gravel road. I parked across the street and waited. An hour later, a man came out, 50s, thinning hair, medium build. He got into a truck and drove away. I followed him. He stopped at a grocery store. I waited until he came out, then I walked up to him in the parking lot. I said his name. He turned and looked at me, confused. I said, "You knew my son." "Daniel Renford." His face went pale. I said, "I want to know what happened." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "The hospital called me. He's alive." Carl's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked around the parking lot like he was trying to figure out how to leave. Then he looked back at me and said, "I can't talk to you." I said, "Then you can talk to the police." He flinched. Then he said very quietly, "Get in your car and follow me." We drove to a park a few miles away. We sat at a picnic table under a tree, and he told me everything. He said Daniel hadn't died in the accident. The boy who died was someone else, a kid Carl had known. A runaway with no family, no one looking for him. He'd been staying with Carl for a few weeks. He'd borrowed Daniel's car without asking and crashed it. Carl said Daniel had been there when it happened. He'd been at Carl's house. When the police called to report the accident, Carl had panicked. He'd convinced Daniel that if he came forward, there would be questions. Questions about why the other boy had his car. Why Daniel was at Carl's house. What their relationship was. Carl said Daniel had been scared. He'd been 19, confused, and terrified of his family finding out he was gay. Carl said he'd offered Daniel a way out. He said they could let the authorities think Daniel had died in the crash. Carl had access to dental records. He could make the switch. Daniel could disappear, start over somewhere else, live the life he wanted without the shame or the fear. Daniel had agreed. Carl had falsified the records. The body had been identified as Daniel. The case had been closed, and Daniel had vanished. Carl said he'd lost track of him after a few years. He said Daniel had drifted, Oregon, California, Washington. He'd worked odd jobs, stayed off the grid, lived quietly. Carl said he'd tried to reach out once, years ago. But Daniel hadn't responded. I asked him if he felt guilty. He didn't answer. I asked him if he knew Daniel had kept my photo. He looked away. I stood up and walked back to my car. I didn't say anything else. I drove back to the hospital. Daniel was awake. Barely. Groggy and disoriented, but awake. The nurses had called me earlier, but I hadn't been able to answer. I walked into his room. He looked at me with glassy, unfocused eyes. I sat down next to him and took his hand. He blinked. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, very quietly, he said, "Mom?" I said, "I'm here." He closed his eyes. A tear ran down his cheek. I didn't ask him why he'd done it. Not then. Over the next few weeks as he recovered, he told me in pieces. He said he'd been so afraid of disappointing me, of being rejected, of losing everything. He said Carl had made it sound easy, like disappearing was the only way to survive. He said he'd regretted it almost immediately. But by then, it was too late. He couldn't come back. Everyone thought he was dead. He didn't know how to undo it. So he'd lived with it. For 24 years. I asked him why he'd kept the photograph. He said he couldn't let go. I didn't press charges against Carl. I thought about it, but I didn't. What Carl had done was wrong, unforgivably wrong, but prosecuting him wouldn't give me back the years I'd lost. It wouldn't undo the grief or the lies or the damage. I reported the falsified dental records to the state licensing board. They opened an investigation. Carl's license was suspended. I don't know what happened to him after that. I didn't follow up. Daniel stayed with me while he recovered. It was strange at first, having a son I'd mourned for so long suddenly alive and middle-aged, sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee, telling me about the life he'd lived in the margins. We didn't talk about the lost years much. There was no point. We couldn't get them back. But we had time now. That was something. Rachel came to visit a few months later. She and Daniel sat on the back porch and talked for hours. I watched them through the kitchen window and felt something inside me finally exhale. Daniel got a job at a hardware store in town. He rented a small apartment nearby. We had dinner once a week, sometimes more. I still visit the grave sometimes. I know it sounds strange, but I do. I sit there and think about the boy who died in that car, the one no one came looking for. I think about how many people vanish without anyone noticing. How easy it is to be forgotten. I don't have answers for why things happen the way they did. I don't have neat conclusions or lessons learned. What I have is my son, alive flawed, here, and that has to be enough. If you've ever grieved someone who wasn't really gone, if you've ever had to rebuild a life you thought was finished, you're not alone.